Frank Matthews was born with nothing but hunger in his belly and fire in his blood. Durham, North Carolina, 1944, the kind of place where a black boy learned early that the world wasn't built for him to win. His mother died when he was young, and his father was a ghost long before that. Frank raised himself in the streets, watching, learning, understanding that survival wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the smartest, the most calculating, the one who saw opportunities where others saw only walls. By the time he was 16, Frank had already decided that poverty was optional. He didn't want to be another statistic, another broken man shuffling through life with his head down. He wanted power. He wanted respect. He wanted to never feel hungry again. The streets of New York City welcomed him like a mother he never had. Harlem in the 1960s was electric, dangerous, beautiful, and brutal all at once. Frank started small, numbers running, loan sharking, the usual entry points for a young man with ambition and no fear. But Frank wasn't usual. He watched the Italian mob control the heroin trade, and he saw something they didn't. They were old, set in their ways, underestimating everyone who didn't look like them. Frank had a gift for mathematics, for logistics, for seeing patterns in chaos. He understood supply chains before he knew the term. He understood that the real money wasn't in selling on corners. It was in controlling the supply, cutting out the middlemen, dealing directly with the source. While other dealers were fighting over blocks, Frank was thinking about countries. By 1968, at just 24 years old, Frank Matthews had done what seemed impossible. He built a drug empire that stretched across 21 states, not through violence alone, though he could be violent when necessary, not through loyalty alone, though he inspired fierce loyalty. He built it through intelligence, through organization, through treating his operation like a legitimate business with profit margins and growth projections and strategic partnerships. Frank didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as an entrepreneur in an illegal market, providing a product people wanted, just like any other businessman. The fact that white America had made his avenues to legitimate wealth nearly impossible didn't bother him with guilt. It clarified his purpose. He dealt directly with the French connection, cutting out the Italian Mafia entirely. This was revolutionary. This was dangerous. This made him a target. But it also made him rich, richer than any black criminal in American history. At his peak, Frank Matthews was moving hundreds of kilograms of heroin monthly. His organization grossed over $20 million annually in 1970s money. He was living in a luxury apartment on Riverside Drive. He drove expensive cars, wore tailored suits, carried himself like the businessman he believed himself to be. Frank had a sharp mind for detail. He remembered faces, names, numbers, debts, and favors. He could calculate profit margins in his head faster than most people could with a calculator. He spoke softly, rarely raised his voice, and when he smiled, it was calculated, a tool, not an expression of joy. His eyes were dark and watchful, always assessing, always 3 moves ahead. But Frank had a weakness, and he knew it. He loved beautiful women. He loved the good life. He loved showing that a black man from nowhere could have everything the white world said was impossible. This wasn't just greed. It was defiance, a middle finger to every system that tried to crush him before he could walk. By 1971, Frank Matthews was at the absolute pinnacle of his power. He'd organized a meeting in Atlanta with the major black drug dealers from across the country, not to form an alliance with the mafia to replace them entirely. Frank stood in that hotel conference room with men from Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and he told them something revolutionary. They didn't need the Italians. They could control their own supply, their own distribution, their own destiny. Some called it the first Black Mafia Summit. Frank called it business. But power attracts attention, and attention from the wrong people is dangerous. The DEA had been watching Frank for months. Federal agents had infiltrated his organization, documented his movements, traced his connections. They knew he was big, but they didn't know how big until they really started digging. What they found terrified them, a criminal network so sophisticated, so well organized, so flush with cash that it operated like a multinational corporation. Frank knew they were coming. He always knew he had informants in police departments, connections in federal offices, people who whispered warnings for the right price. He'd prepared for this day, had contingency plans, escape routes, hidden money, false identities. Frank Matthews didn't believe in being caught. He believed in being prepared. The morning of July 2nd, 1973 started like any other. Frank woke in his apartment, the sun streaming through expensive curtains, his girlfriend Barbara asleep beside him. He had a meeting that afternoon, some business to handle in Brooklyn, nothing unusual. He dressed carefully, a perfectly tailored suit, Italian leather shoes, a gold watch that cost more than most people made in a year. He looked in the mirror and saw what he'd built himself into, powerful, untouchable, successful. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last normal day of his life as Frank Matthews, criminal kingpin. That evening, Frank and Barbara were supposed to meet associates at a restaurant. They never arrived. Somewhere between his apartment and that meeting, Frank Matthews disappeared, vanished. Evaporated into thin air with Barbara Hinton and at least $15 million in cash. Some estimates said it was closer to $20 million. The DEA raided his apartment days later and found nothing but expensive furniture and a few photographs. No money, no drugs, no Frank Matthews. The authorities were stunned. They'd been building a case for months, preparing arrests, organizing raids across multiple states. They'd been so close, and now their primary target was gone, as if he'd never existed. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was where Frank had gone or how he'd managed such a complete disappearance. No confirmed sightings, no credible leads, no body ever found. Frank Matthews had done something almost impossible in the modern age. He'd vanished completely, taking millions of dollars and his girlfriend with him, leaving behind only questions and theories and a legend that would grow with every passing year. Some said he was dead, killed by rivals or former partners. Some said he was in Africa, living like a king in a country with no extradition treaty. Some said he was in South America, running a new operation under a new name. Some said he'd gotten plastic surgery and was living quietly in the American suburbs. His millions carefully laundered and invested, watching the news stories about himself with quiet amusement. The truth was, nobody knew, and that was exactly how Frank Matthews wanted it. In the criminal underworld, Frank became a legend. The man who beat the system, the black man who'd become richer than the Italian mob, who'd controlled an empire spanning half the country, who'd walked away free while everyone else went to prison. His name was whispered with respect and envy. Young dealers studied his methods, tried to emulate his success, dreamed of achieving what he'd achieved. But Frank's disappearance was more than just a criminal success story. It was a statement. It said that the system wasn't unbeatable. It said that intelligence and planning could triumph over unlimited federal resources. It said that a black man from poverty could not only win in America, but could win so completely that he walked away untouched, unpunished, free. Frank Matthews had become something more than a man. He'd become an idea, a symbol, a ghost that haunted federal law enforcement for decades. The DEA never closed his case. They kept looking, kept following leads, kept hoping for that one break that would solve the mystery. They never got it. And somewhere, maybe on a beach in a country whose name we'll never know, or in a quiet house in a suburb we'd never suspect, or in a grave that will never be found, Frank Matthews exists, either living the ultimate victory or paying the ultimate price for his ambition. But here's what we know for certain in that moment when Frank Matthews decided to disappear, when he looked at the life he'd built and the prison sentence that awaited him and chose a third option that nobody saw coming, he committed the perfect crime. Not the drug dealing, not the money laundering, not the empire building. The perfect crime was vanishing so completely that 50 years later, we're still talking about him, still wondering, still unable to close the book on the richest criminal America never caught. The decision to disappear wasn't made in a moment of panic. Frank Matthews wasn't the type to panic. He'd been planning his exit for months, maybe years, with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd applied to building his empire. Every successful criminal knows that the game has two possible endings, prison or death. Frank had decided on a third option long before the walls started closing in. In early 1973, Frank began to sense the pressure mounting. Informants were getting nervous. Associates were being arrested on smaller charges, the kind that made men think about cooperation, about reducing sentences by giving up bigger fish. Frank could read the signs like a meteorologist reading storm clouds. The question wasn't if the storm would come, it was when and whether he'd be standing in its path when it hit. Frank had always been careful about money, not just making it, but hiding it. While other dealers were flashy, buying cars they registered in their own names, houses that could be traced, Frank had been quietly moving money offshore for years. He had accounts in banks that asked no questions, in countries that valued privacy over cooperation with American law enforcement. He had gold, diamonds, cash buried in places only he knew. He'd been preparing for this day since the first dollar crossed his palm. Barbara Hinton was 26, beautiful, sophisticated, and completely devoted to Frank. She'd been with him for 3 years, long enough to see past the money and the power to the man underneath, the calculating genius who could be surprisingly tender, surprisingly vulnerable in private moments. She was the only person Frank truly trusted, the only person who saw him without his armor. In late June, Frank sat her down in their apartment. The city hummed outside, oblivious to the conversation that would change everything. "Barbara," he said quietly, his dark eyes steady on hers, "we need to leave soon, maybe in days." She didn't look surprised. Barbara was smart. She'd sensed the change in him, the increased wariness, the way he checked over his shoulder more frequently, the late-night phone calls conducted in hushed tones. "Where?" she asked simply. "Does it matter?" She thought about this. "No, not if I'm with you." Frank reached across the table and took her hand. This wasn't his usual calculated gesture. This was real. "If we do this, we can never come back, never contact family, never use our real names again. Everything we were dies. we become new people. And if we don't, I'm looking at 20 years minimum, probably life. They're building a case, Barbara. A big one. I've got sources telling me indictments are coming, multiple agencies, multiple states. They want to make an example of me. Because you're black. Frank smiled without humor. Because I'm black and successful. Because I proved you don't need them. That's the real crime in their eyes. Barbara squeezed his hand. Then we leave when I'll know the right moment. Be ready. The next few days were a careful ballet of preparation disguised as normal routine. Frank met with associates, collected debts, liquidated assets that could be quickly converted to cash. He moved with his usual calm efficiency, giving no indication that each goodbye might be permanent. He collected information, passport forgers, pilots who didn't ask questions, routes that avoided official scrutiny. On July 1st, Frank got the call he'd been waiting for. His contact in the federal building, a clerk who supplemented her income by sharing information, told him that indictments were being prepared. Multiple jurisdictions coordinated arrest planned for the following week. Frank would be the primary target. He thanked her, hung up, and looked at Barbara. Tomorrow, we leave tomorrow. That night, Frank went to his various caches across the city. Money buried in storage units registered under false names. Cash hidden in safety deposit boxes in banks in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx. Gold coins wrapped in waterproof packages and buried in remote areas of parks. Diamonds sewn into the lining of expensive coats. He'd been preparing for years, and now it was time to collect. By the time dawn broke on July 2nd, Frank had consolidated approximately $15 million in easily portable wealth, primarily cash and jewelry. Some estimates later suggested it could have been as much as $20 million, but only Frank knew the true number. He'd arranged for a car, paid cash to a man who asked no questions. He'd secured false identification, not cheap forgeries, but sophisticated documents that could pass serious scrutiny, costing tens of thousands of dollars. He had contacts at private airfields, pilots who flew planes without filing flight plans, without going through customs, without leaving paper trails. Frank and Barbara left the apartment around noon, carrying only 2 suitcases and a leather bag that weighed far more than it should. To anyone watching, they looked like a successful couple going on vacation. Nobody could have guessed they were walking away from everything forever. The car took them to a private airfield in New Jersey, the kind of place where wealthy men kept their private planes and nobody asked uncomfortable questions as long as the money was good. Frank had paid very good money. The pilot was a white man in his 50s, former military, the type who'd seen enough in his life to develop a profitable allergy to curiosity. He looked at the suitcases at Frank and Barbara and said nothing. He'd been paid $50,000 in cash, $25,000 up front, $25,000 on successful delivery. He didn't know where they were going. Frank would tell him in the air over the ocean when turning back became impossible. As the small plane taxied down the runway, Frank looked back at New York City one last time. He'd built an empire there. He'd become a legend there. He'd proven that a black man from nothing could beat the system, could win against impossible odds, could take everything the white world said was forbidden and claim it as his own. Now he was walking away from it all, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Prison was death by another name, slow, grinding, purposeless death. This way, even if he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, he'd spend it free, wealthy, and victorious. The plane lifted off, climbing into a clear summer sky. Below, millions of people went about their ordinary lives having no idea that one of the most wanted criminals in America was literally flying away from justice, carrying a fortune and a legend with him. Frank Matthews leaned back in his seat and allowed himself a small smile. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. What he couldn't know, what nobody could know, was that this disappearance would become his greatest achievement. Not the empire he'd built, not the millions he'd made, not the revolutionary idea of black criminals controlling their own destiny. His greatest achievement would be staying disappeared, staying free, staying one step ahead of the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in the world. The plane flew south, then turned east over the Atlantic. Frank gave the pilot coordinates he'd memorized weeks ago. First stop, a private airfield in the Caribbean, a place where American jurisdiction was more theory than practice, where cash bought discretion and officials looked the other way for the right price. From there, the trail would go cold. Multiple identities, multiple countries, a deliberate confusion of movements designed to make tracking impossible. Frank had studied the successful escapes, learned from others' mistakes. He knew that most fugitives got caught because they established patterns, because they couldn't resist contacting loved ones, because they eventually relaxed and made mistakes. Frank Matthews promised himself he would never relax, never contact anyone from his old life, never establish patterns, never make mistakes. Barbara sat beside him, looking out the window at the ocean below. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That we're dead now," Frank said quietly. "Frank Matthews and Barbara Hinton died today. Whoever we become next, we have to commit to it completely. No looking back, no regrets, no nostalgia. We're new people starting from this moment." "I can do that," Barbara said. "Can you?" Frank considered this honestly. Could he walk away from being Frank Matthews, from the reputation, the respect, the fear, the power? Could he become nobody, remain nobody, accept anonymity as the price of freedom? Yes, he said finally, I'd rather be free and forgotten than famous and in a cage. The plane continued south, carrying them toward a future that remains unknown to this day. Behind them, the largest manhunt in DEA history was about to begin. Federal agents would search everywhere, literally everywhere. They'd follow leads to Africa, South America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia. They'd interview thousands of people, chase hundreds of rumors, raid dozens of locations. They'd find nothing because Frank Matthews hadn't just disappeared. He'd prepared to disappear with the same intelligence and attention to detail he'd applied to everything else in his life. And preparation, as Frank had always known, was the difference between success and failure, between freedom and prison, between legend and cautionary tale. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean on a small plane heading toward a destination that would never be confirmed, Frank Matthews committed his perfect crime, vanishing so completely that even now, more than 50 years later, nobody knows for certain whether he's alive or dead, free or imprisoned by his own success, triumphant or tragic. The DEA discovered Frank Matthews was gone on July 5, 1973, when agents arrived at his Riverside Drive apartment with arrest warrants and found it empty. Not just empty of people, meticulously, deliberately empty of anything useful. The expensive furniture remained, but there were no papers, no records, no address books, no photographs that might provide clues. It was as if Frank had surgically removed every trace of his future plans while leaving the stage set of his past life perfectly intact. Special agent in charge Robert Tobin stood in that apartment looking at the expensive curtains, the leather sofa, the view of the Hudson River, and felt something close to admiration mixed with fury. He'd been chasing Matthews for 18 months, building what should have been an airtight case against one of the biggest drug traffickers in American history. Now his primary target had vanished like smoke. He knew, Tobin said to his partner, he knew exactly when we were coming. The question of whether Frank had an informant inside federal law enforcement would haunt investigators for years. The timing was too perfect, the preparation too thorough. Someone had warned him. Someone had given him enough advance notice to liquidate assets, collect hidden money, arrange transportation, and disappear without leaving a forwarding address. The investigation that followed was massive, unprecedented in scope. The DEA put Frank Matthews at the top of their most wanted list. They coordinated with Interpol, with law enforcement agencies across Latin America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. They offered rewards for information. They followed every lead, no matter how thin. They found nothing concrete, only ghosts and rumors. In late July, there was a reported sighting in Montreal. Agents rushed north, interviewed witnesses, investigated hotels and airports. The trail went cold. The man resembling Frank Matthews had disappeared if he'd ever been there at all. In August, informants claimed Frank was in Caracas, Venezuela, a country with notoriously lax cooperation with American law enforcement. The DEA pressured Venezuelan authorities, who made a show of searching but found nothing. Some agents suspected Frank had paid off local police. Others thought the sighting was deliberate misinformation designed to send investigators running in the wrong direction. September brought reports from West Africa, specifically Ghana and Nigeria, countries with growing African-American expatriate communities, places where a wealthy black American man might blend in, might be welcomed, might find protection from extradition. Federal agents contacted American embassies, requested assistance from local authorities. They interviewed contacts in those countries. Again, nothing solid materialized. The pattern continued for months, then years. Sightings in Jamaica, rumors of Frank living in the Dominican Republic, claims he'd been spotted in Amsterdam, in the south of France, in Bangkok. Every lead was investigated, every rumor chased, every supposed witness interviewed. But here's what made the Frank Matthews case uniquely frustrating for investigators. The sightings were always plausible but never verifiable. The informants always seemed credible but could never provide proof. It was as if Frank, or someone who understood how investigations worked, was deliberately feeding false information into the system, keeping agents running in circles, chasing their own tails, while the real Frank Matthews remained safely hidden elsewhere. Special Agent Tobin retired in 1985, 12 years after Frank's disappearance, without ever solving the case. It haunted him. He'd give interviews occasionally, always saying the same thing. Frank Matthews was smarter than most people gave him credit for. He planned his escape like he planned his business, meticulously with contingencies and backups. He knew we were coming, and he knew how to disappear. That takes resources, intelligence, and iron discipline. The criminal underworld filled in the blanks that investigators couldn't. Stories circulated, grew, became legend. Some said Frank had gone to Africa and was living like a king, that he'd become an advisor to government officials, that his drug network had simply relocated to a more permissive environment. Others claimed he'd gotten plastic surgery and was living in suburban America under an assumed identity, that the DEA had passed him on the street a dozen times without recognizing him. There were darker theories. Some believe Frank had been killed by former associates, that his disappearance wasn't voluntary but fatal, that his body was buried somewhere and would never be found. They pointed to the dangerous men he'd done business with, the money he'd owed or been owed, the grudges that accumulate in the drug trade. But if Frank had been murdered, nobody ever came forward to claim credit or seek reward money, which was unusual in the criminal world where such information typically had value. Theories about Frank Matthews' fate became a kind of street mythology, each story reflecting the beliefs and biases of the storyteller. Young dealers saw in him proof that the system could be beaten, that intelligence and planning could triumph over overwhelming force. Law enforcement saw him as the one that got away, the ultimate frustration in careers spent catching criminals. Sociologists saw him as a symbol of black economic aspirations in an oppressive system, the dark twin of legitimate entrepreneurs fighting similar obstacles. One of the more credible theories emerged in the 1980s from a former associate who'd spent years in federal prison for his own role in the organization. He claimed that Frank had established himself in a Central American country with a young government, corrupt officials, and porous borders. According to this source, Frank had legitimized his money through real estate investments and business ventures, had married a local woman, had children, had become effectively invisible by becoming ordinary, just another wealthy foreigner in a place where wealthy foreigners asked few questions about each other's pasts. Was this true? Investigators couldn't confirm it. The source had an incentive to seem important, to claim inside knowledge he might not actually possess, but it had the ring of plausibility. It matched Frank's intelligence and planning abilities. It described exactly the kind of long-term strategy Frank might execute. The years passed. The 1970s became the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. DEA procedures evolved. Technology improved. International cooperation increased. But Frank Matthews remained unfound. His case file grew thicker with dead-end reports and unverifiable sightings, but no closer to resolution. In 1997, there was brief excitement when bones were discovered in Queens that some thought might be Frank's. DNA testing ruled out that possibility. The bones belonged to someone else. Frank remained ghost-like, neither definitively alive nor confirmably dead. By the 2000s, Frank's case had become something federal agents studied in training, an example of how a sophisticated criminal could defeat even comprehensive investigation through preparation and discipline. It was also studied in criminal justice courses, in documentaries, in books about notorious American criminals. Frank Matthews had achieved a strange kind of immortality. If he'd been caught and imprisoned, he'd have been forgotten like hundreds of other drug dealers. If he'd been killed, he'd have been a cautionary tale and nothing more. But by disappearing completely, by remaining missing for decades, he'd become something larger than life, a legend, a mystery, a symbol of the possibility that the system wasn't unbeatable after all. In Harlem and Brooklyn, in Philadelphia and Detroit, in every city where Frank had once operated, old-timers still spoke his name with respect. Frank Matthews beat them all, they'd say. Never spent a day in jail, never got caught. That's how you do it. You be smarter than them, you plan better than them, you stay disciplined, and you walk away clean. Young dealers heard these stories and saw in Frank a hero, even though he trafficked poison, even though his heroin had destroyed countless lives and families. They ignored that part. They focused on the success story, the rags to riches transformation, the defiance of a system designed to keep black men poor and powerless. Frank Matthews became, in the mythology of the streets, a kind of folk hero, the trickster who outwitted the powerful, the clever man who escaped impossible odds. Was this fair? Was it accurate? Did Frank Matthews deserve to be celebrated? These questions have different answers depending on who you ask. From one perspective, Frank was a criminal who profited from addiction, who caused immeasurable suffering, who was responsible for an unknowable amount of death and destruction from the drugs he sold. His victims weren't theoretical. They were real people, real families, real communities devastated by heroin addiction in the 1960s and 1970s. From another perspective, Frank was a product of systematic oppression, a man born into a society that offered him no legitimate paths to success, who took the only road available to him and walked it better than anyone else had before. His crime wasn't worse than the corporate criminals who went unpunished, the politicians who destroyed lives through policy, the systems that created the conditions for people like Frank to emerge in the first place. Both perspectives have truth. Both perspectives are incomplete. What we can say with certainty is that Frank Matthews was exceptional, exceptionally intelligent, exceptionally organized, exceptionally capable of seeing opportunities others missed and executing plans others couldn't imagine. Whether he used those exceptional abilities for good or evil is less clear. What's clear is that he used them effectively. The question that remains 5 decades later is simple but unanswerable. Where did Frank Matthews go, and is he still there? What does it take to successfully disappear? Not for days or weeks, but for decades. Not as an ordinary person nobody's looking for, but as one of the most wanted fugitives in America. The answer lies in understanding the mind of Frank Matthews, or rather the mind of whoever Frank Matthews became. Disappearing completely requires specific disciplines, each of which demands constant vigilance, constant sacrifice, constant denial of basic human impulses. Let's explore them, because understanding these disciplines helps us understand what Frank's life after July 2nd, 1973 might have been like. The first discipline is identity death. This doesn't mean getting a fake passport and calling yourself a new name while essentially remaining yourself. It means killing Frank Matthews completely. Every habit, every speech pattern, every reference to your past, every connection to your history. It means never slipping, never referring to things only Frank would know, never getting drunk or nostalgic and revealing yourself through careless words. If Frank truly disappeared successfully, he had to become someone else so completely that he himself forgot Frank Matthews in his daily life. He had to adopt a new biography, a new history, a new set of memories that he could reference naturally. He had to tell lies so consistently and for so long that they became effectively true, at least in his conscious mind. This requires extraordinary psychological strength. Human beings are social creatures who define ourselves through our relationships and histories. To voluntarily erase your own history, to deny every achievement and experience that made you who you are, to never speak truthfully about your past, this is a unique form of torture, even if self-imposed for self-preservation. Imagine Frank, wherever he went, whatever name he took, he'd been the most successful black criminal in American history. He'd built an empire, commanded respect, lived at the apex of power and wealth. Now, to stay free, he had to become nobody, had to let people underestimate him, had to keep his intelligence hidden, his achievements unmentioned, his pride suppressed. Could he do it? For days, certainly. For months, probably. For years, decades. That requires a strength of will that most people simply don't possess. The second discipline is isolation from the past. This means never contacting family, friends, associates from before. Not once, not on birthdays or holidays, not when family members died, not when children were born, never. Frank had family in Durham in New York. Did he have children? The records aren't clear, but if he did, to stay disappeared, he had to abandon them completely. He had to accept that they would grow up thinking him dead or not caring about them. He had to let go of every meaningful relationship in his life except for Barbara, and even that relationship existed in an artificial bubble, cut off from everything that had defined it. Most fugitives get caught because they can't maintain this discipline. They call their mother on Christmas. They attend a sibling's funeral. They reach out to an old friend during a moment of loneliness. One phone call, one letter, one contact is all it takes. Investigators monitor the families of fugitives for years, waiting for exactly this moment of weakness. Frank had to resist these impulses for decades, had to feel the loneliness, the isolation, the loss of human connection, and simply endure it, had to become comfortable with a profound alienation from his own history and identity. The third discipline is financial invisibility. Frank disappeared with at least $15 million, possibly more. In 1973, this was an immense fortune, equivalent to perhaps $100 million in today's money. But having money is useless if you can't spend it, and spending money creates patterns, records, trails. Frank couldn't invest in American financial markets that would require documentation, social security numbers, background checks. He couldn't buy properties in his own name. He couldn't maintain bank accounts in major financial centers where know your customer laws and anti-money laundering regulations would eventually trip him up. He had to convert his cash into forms that were both portable and spendable without creating paper trails. Gold, diamonds, art, real estate in countries with lax documentation requirements. He had to live well below his means, avoiding the kinds of conspicuous consumption that attract attention and questions. This might have been the hardest discipline for Frank because he'd built his empire partly to escape poverty, but also partly to prove something, to show that a black man could have everything America typically reserved for whites. Now, to stay free, he had to hide that wealth, to appear ordinary, to drive regular cars and live in normal houses and never reveal the fortune he'd accumulated. The fourth discipline is geographical wisdom. This means choosing where to disappear carefully, understanding the different risks and opportunities of various locations. Some countries have strong extradition treaties with the United States. Living there would be constant risk. Other countries don't, but they're politically unstable, subject to coups and regime changes that could suddenly make you vulnerable. Some places are so poor that a wealthy American would stand out like a beacon. Others are so expensive that maintaining a low profile is difficult. If Frank survived, he chose wisely. He understood that the best hiding places aren't remote jungle villages or desert compounds, but rather bustling middle-class suburbs where anonymity comes from being ordinary among the ordinary. He knew that Brazil, with its large mixed-race population and complex bureaucracy, offered better camouflage than Iceland, that certain parts of the Caribbean, Central America, or West Africa provided the right balance of discretion, opportunity, and distance from American jurisdiction. The fifth discipline is psychological resilience. Living as a fugitive for decades requires managing constant stress. Every knock on the door could be police. Every stranger's interest could be suspicious. Every news story about other fugitives being caught is a reminder that your freedom is conditional, temporary, fragile. Frank would have needed ways to manage this stress that didn't compromise his security. He couldn't see therapists who might eventually recognize him. He couldn't confide fully even in Barbara because the burden of shared secrets becomes overwhelming over time. He had to develop internal mechanisms for processing stress, fear, loneliness, and the constant awareness of living a lie. Some fugitives break under this psychological pressure. They turn themselves in just to end the stress of hiding. Others develop drinking problems or drug addictions as coping mechanisms. Some simply make careless mistakes because the burden of vigilance becomes too heavy to maintain. If Frank survived, he found healthy ways to manage this psychological burden. Maybe meditation or exercise, maybe losing himself in books or hobbies, maybe simply accepting the reality of his situation so completely that it stopped causing stress and became just the way his life was. There's a philosophical dimension to Frank's disappearance that makes it particularly fascinating. He made a choice that most criminals never consider seriously, trading his identity for his freedom, not his life, his identity. Frank Matthews ceased to exist. Whatever he became afterward, it wasn't Frank Matthews. It was someone else entirely, someone new, someone who carried Frank's memories but lived a completely different life. In a strange way, this was a kind of death and rebirth. The old Frank died on that plane ride. A new person was born, carrying nothing forward but memories and money. This new person couldn't bask in his achievements or enjoy his reputation. He could only live quietly, privately, knowing what he'd done but unable to speak of it. Was this victory or defeat, freedom or prison? The answer depends on what you value. If you value reputation, recognition, the ability to be publicly who you authentically are, then Frank's disappearance was a tragedy, a man forced to erase himself to avoid imprisonment. If you value freedom above all else, then it was the ultimate triumph, a man who beat impossible odds and lived free when everyone expected him to spend his life in a cell. Consider Barbara in all this. She didn't have to disappear. She could have stayed behind, claimed ignorance of Frank's crimes, and lived openly, if anonymously. But she chose to go with him, to share his exile, to give up her own identity and history and family to be with him. This suggests a relationship depth that most people never experience, complete mutual trust, complete mutual commitment, a love tested by the hardest possible circumstances. Did they make it work? Did their relationship survive the stress of permanent flight, or did they eventually separate, unable to sustain intimacy under such artificial conditions? We don't know. That's part of the mystery. By the 2000s, if Frank was still alive, he would have been in his 60s, having lived decades as someone else. His old empire was forgotten except by historians and old-timers. The drug trade had evolved beyond recognition. The people who'd known Frank Matthews were mostly dead or imprisoned. He'd become a ghost story, a legend, a piece of criminal history rather than a living threat. In some ways, time became Frank's ally. As years passed, the urgency of finding him diminished. Agents who'd worked his case retired. The DEA's resources shifted to newer threats. Crack cocaine in the 1980s, methamphetamine in the 1990s, prescription opioids in the 2000s. Frank's case file remained open, but it was no longer a continued 2316 priority. He'd become cold case material, more historical curiosity than active investigation. If Frank lived into old age, he might have experienced a strange kind of peace. The constant fear of capture would have faded as he realized that he'd actually done it, actually beaten the system, actually remained free long enough that the world moved on without him. He could look back on his life with satisfaction, not pride in the harm he'd caused perhaps, but satisfaction in the intellectual achievement of outsmarting everyone. Or maybe not. Maybe the loss of identity, the decades of isolation, the inability to ever truly be himself again created a different kind of prison, internal rather than external, but prison nonetheless. Maybe Frank spent his later years regretting his choices, wishing he'd faced trial, served his time, and been able to live the back half of his life openly instead of in shadow. We'll likely never know. And that ambiguity, that unanswered question, is what keeps Frank Matthews' story alive half a century later. In 2026, more than 50 years after his disappearance, Frank Matthews remains officially missing. The DEA case file stays technically active, though nobody seriously expects to find him now. If he survived, he'd be 82 years old. If he died as a fugitive, his body was never identified. Either way, he achieved what so few criminals manage. He escaped completely and stayed escaped. But what does his story actually mean? What lessons, if any, can we draw from the life and disappearance of Frank Matthews? On the surface, it's a classic American success story, just operating outside legal boundaries. Frank was born with nothing, built an empire through intelligence and hard work, and escaped before consequences caught up with him. He demonstrated that systematic disadvantages could be overcome through exceptional ability and ruthless focus. In a perverse way, he achieved the American dream just through the American nightmare of drug trafficking. But there's a darker interpretation. Frank's success came at immense human cost. The heroin he imported destroyed countless lives. Families were torn apart by addiction. Children grew up without parents or with parents so consumed by drugs they became strangers. Communities were devastated. All of this suffering financed Frank's luxury apartment, his expensive cars, his path to legendary status. The people Frank harmed never got to disappear. They stayed trapped in addiction, in poverty, in the consequences of decisions that heroin made for them. The mothers whose children overdosed didn't get to walk away. The communities poisoned by drugs didn't get to fresh starts with new identities. Only Frank got that privilege, bought with money extracted from human suffering. Yet there's also a systemic critique embedded in Frank's story. He emerged from a society that offered black Americans few legitimate paths to wealth and power. The doors to conventional success were largely closed, not completely, but enough that criminality became a rational choice for someone with ambition and no access to capital or opportunity. Frank didn't create the conditions that made drug dealing attractive. He just exploited them more successfully than most. Consider the contrast between Frank Matthews and white criminals of his era. When white-collar criminals steal millions through fraud, they often face minimal sentences or no prosecution at all. When corporate executives poison communities with pollution or defective products, they settle lawsuits without admitting guilt. Justice in America has always been applied unequally, with poor people and people of color facing harsher consequences for smaller crimes than wealthy white people face for larger ones. Frank understood this. He saw the hypocrisy clearly. He didn't see himself as morally worse than legitimate businessmen who destroyed lives through perfectly legal means. He saw himself as playing the same game with less protection, fewer advantages, and higher risks. His disappearance was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. If the system is rigged, if the rules don't apply fairly, then why accept its judgment? But recognizing systematic injustice doesn't excuse individual harm. Frank made choices. He could have used his intelligence differently. He could have worked within communities to create legitimate opportunities rather than feeding them poison. His circumstances explain his choices, but don't absolve him of responsibility for those choices. The mythology that grew around Frank in criminal circles is troubling because it celebrates the wrong things. Young dealers idolizing Frank focus on his wealth and freedom while ignoring the destruction he caused. They see someone who beat the system without understanding that beating the system meant leaving countless victims in his wake. This selective memory turns a drug trafficker into a hero, which serves nobody well. Yet the fascination with Frank Matthews isn't entirely misguided. There's something genuinely remarkable about his disappearance that transcends moral judgment. He did something that seems impossible in the modern surveillance state. He vanished in an era when borders were less porous, when international travel required more documentation, when simply being black and wealthy made you conspicuous in most of the world. Yet he managed it. This speaks to the power of preparation, intelligence, and discipline. Whatever else Frank was, he was exceptionally capable. He saw possibilities others missed. He planned when others improvised. He executed when others hesitated. These are valuable traits even if applied to criminal ends. If we could somehow interview Frank today, if he miraculously agreed to tell his story truthfully, what might he say? Based on what we know of his psychology and situation, we might hear something like this. I did what I had to do. America in the 1950s and 60s wasn't offering people like me many choices. I could have worked minimum wage jobs and died poor. I could have accepted my station and been grateful for scraps. Or I could have taken what I wanted, built something nobody said I could build, proven that I was just as smart and capable as anyone else. I chose option 3. Do I regret the harm I caused? I think about it. But I also think about the harm caused by poverty, by systematic exclusion, by a society that valued white lives over black lives. I wasn't the disease, I was a symptom. The disease was bigger than me. As for disappearing, that wasn't weakness, that was strategy. Prison doesn't rehabilitate people, it destroys them. Why would I volunteer for destruction when I had the resources to avoid it? I built something remarkable. I wasn't going to let them take it away just because they wrote laws saying what I did was wrong. Powerful people break laws all the time and face no consequences. I just did it more honestly. Would I do it again? That's the wrong question. I did it. It happened. I became Frank Matthews, and then I became someone else. Both of those people are real. Both of those lives matter. You want to know if I'm sorry? I'm sorry for specific things, specific harm, specific victims, but I'm not sorry for existing, for trying, for succeeding on my own terms, rather than accepting failure on society's terms. And I'm not sorry for staying free. That's my real legacy. Not the money, not the empire, not the drugs. My legacy is proving that it's possible to walk away, to beat the system completely, to live free when everyone says freedom is impossible. That idea is worth more than anything I sold. Would this be true self-reflection or rationalization? Both, probably. Most people, when explaining their lives, mix honesty with self-justification. Frank would be no different. The truth is probably this: Frank Matthews was a complex person who made choices in circumstances that don't admit easy moral judgments. He caused harm while also demonstrating extraordinary ability. He exploited weakness while also exposing systematic injustice. He achieved something remarkable while also leaving destruction in his wake. All of these things are simultaneously true. His disappearance raises questions beyond his individual story. It asks us to consider what justice means, whether our criminal justice system actually serves justice, why certain people turn to crime and others don't, how much individual responsibility matters versus systematic forces, and what price freedom is worth. These aren't questions with simple answers. They're questions each person has to answer for themselves based on their values, experiences, and understanding of human nature and social systems. What we can say with certainty is this: Frank Matthews disappeared on July 2nd, 1973, and has never been found. Whether he's living under an assumed name somewhere in the world, whether he died decades ago in circumstances that remain unknown, whether he's buried in an unmarked grave or sitting on a beach somewhere watching the sunset, we don't know. And maybe that's exactly what Frank intended to become: a permanent question mark. To be remembered not for what happened to him, but for what didn't happen: his capture, his trial, his imprisonment. He transformed himself from a person into a mystery, from a criminal into a legend, from a historical figure into an ongoing story without resolution. In doing so, Frank Matthews achieved a strange kind of immortality. People who built bigger empires, made more money, had more power, they're forgotten now, reduced to footnotes in history books. But Frank is remembered precisely because he disappeared. The absence is what makes him present. The unanswered question is what keeps people asking. This might be the ultimate irony of Frank Matthews' life. He spent years building an empire to make himself somebody important, somebody powerful, somebody who couldn't be ignored. But his real achievement, the thing that actually made him unforgettable, was making himself nobody, disappearing so completely that 50 years later we're still wondering where he went. That's not just criminality, that's art. The crime was ordinary. Thousands of people have trafficked drugs. The disappearance was extraordinary. Almost nobody has ever done it this successfully. So Frank Matthews remains at large, officially speaking. He remains uncaught, officially speaking. He remains one of the great unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. And somewhere, maybe in some quiet place where nobody knows his real name or his real story, an old man, if he's still alive, occasionally allows himself a small private smile because he did it. He actually did it. He beat the system completely, stayed free forever, and turned his escape into legend. Or maybe there's no old man, maybe there's just bones somewhere, unmarked and unidentified, ending a story that we'll never know was over. Maybe Frank died decades ago and we're all wondering about a ghost. That's the beauty and frustration of it. We don't know, we may never know, and that uncertainty, that permanent mystery, is Frank Matthews' final and most complete victory. He didn't just escape prison, he escaped closure, he escaped the ending every other criminal eventually faces. He escaped into ambiguity and stayed there forever. And that, more than anything else he accomplished, is why we're still talking about him. Frank Matthews, the criminal who disappeared, the legend who never came back, the question that has no answer, the man who proved that sometimes in exceptional circumstances with exceptional preparation and exceptional luck, you really can just walk away.